A little bit of course and business before we get going. It looks like I'm not going to be able to get your tests back to you on Thursday. That was my ambitious goal. I will certainly get them physically back to you on Tuesday of next week, so 2 weeks after the test. I will endeavor to post the marks over the weekend, so Friday, Saturday kind of thing. Yeah, so I didn't meet my more ambitious goals. Just got a lot going on, what with climate change and all, it keeps you busy. I actually think that's a legitimate excuse for anything that you need extra slack on. If you want an extension on your final essay, just be like, due to climate change related issues, I need another 3 days on my final essay. I think that's actually, if you think about it, an extremely legitimate excuse. Anyway, yeah. Okay, so there's that. I will, yeah, so I'm working away at them. They look good. The essays look very reasonable, exactly like I was kind of expecting. Like, they're in general, you've said a bunch of stuff. It makes sense. It's not as well structured as your short essays because of course it wouldn't be. That's normal to be expected. That's not going to be like a killer problem for you. The other thing that we need to think about is the final essay. I've posted on Quirkus the text of the final essay's assignment just moments ago, literally moments ago. But it's exactly what I've been saying all along, which is, so I'll just go over I posted a kind of like lengthy bit of text for this one. I think there should be nothing unexpected in here, but so for your final essay, you're generating a topic yourself. The only constraint is that it has to relate in some significant way to the course material. And if that's unclear, that is a bit vague. If you have any doubt whether your thing relates to the course material, just get in touch with me, run it by me. I'm happy to give you feedback on whether I think it's related enough or if it's a reasonable enough proposal. So this is also stuff I've said before. Your essay should make a novel and challenging argument for a specific thesis. That is, it should be novel in the sense, so your argument needs to be novel, not necessarily your conclusion. It's perfectly okay to argue for a conclusion that lots of other people believe, but your specific way of arguing, the evidence you bring to bear, the narrative that you produce to make me think that your thesis is true should be novel in the sense that you're not just repeating what other people have said about it. Yeah?
So this essay is philosophical?
So broadly, yes. Broadly. That's... Well, okay, so what is philosophy really? I proposed, my favorite definition of philosophy comes from Wilfrid Sellers in his fabulous paper, The Scientific and Manifest Image of Man. He says philosophy is the following. Philosophy is the endeavor to understand how things in the most general sense of things hang together in the most general sense of hang together. So philosophy, properly conceived, in my opinion, is seeing how things fit together that are apparently different, seeing the unity in things, seeing how the big picture sort of holds together. So in that very broad sense, yes, I do want your essay to be philosophical. Some people who shall remain nameless think philosophy is entirely a priori, that is, there's no evidence or like you don't need to consider what's happening in the world. I disagree with that definition of philosophy. I think that that's a silly one. So if you're doing a kind of psychologically based paper, that fits very nicely with the first one. If what you're doing is saying, look, we've got all this evidence and I think we should think about it in this way. So you give me a big picture of psychology, that's good philosophy. Or give me a big picture of philosophical issues, that's also good philosophy. So my picture of philosophy is very inclusive. All it requires is that there got to be some big picture thinking in it. So broadly, in that very broad sense of philosophy, yeah, it's got to be a philosophical paper. Okay, that was maybe more of an answer than you were expecting, but yeah. So does that make sense? Like,
yeah.
Okay.
Just because for the essay workshop,
yeah.
They said like very specifically, don't put like experiments, like don't discuss like psychological stuff.
Okay, so I should have talked to them more extensively because that's kind of the standard for this course when other people are teaching it. I'm going to, for the purposes of our semester, relax that constraint. So I should communicate that to them. Yeah, so yeah, in the past there's been a more crisp distinction between the first essay is psych and the second essay is philosophy. I'm okay with doing philosophy of psychology in the sense that of seeing how a bunch of psychology papers have a kind of theoretical lesson that you can extract from them. There is something to that though, however. So what I don't want to see on this essay is just you reporting the content of a bunch of psych experiments. So if you're just reporting the content of a bunch of psych experiments, like one after the other, without extracting some global lesson from it, then that's too much on the psychology side of things. I don't want just a lit review. I want you to be defending some thesis that you're arguing for. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay, so that's the novel part. Here is the challenging part. It's got to be something that's kind of hard to establish in some important sense. So if your thesis is cognition is hard to understand, that's not a challenging thesis because that's not something anybody would disagree with, right? There's got to be something at least a little bit challenging to establish. Don't set yourself an incredibly easy goal. Set yourself a mildly difficult goal and give me an argument that's coming out of your voice for it. Yeah? Okay. So just some formatting stuff. I mean, this is just exactly the same as for the first essay, APA style. I would like page numbers this time. Please give me page numbers for your citations. So abstract, describe your topic, your thesis about the topic, and a rough outline of your argument for the thesis. Essay should be given with a title page, informative title, date of submission, about 3,000 words, plus or minus 10% is fine. And it's recommended that your essay be, I recommend, this is so a new recommendation, I recommend you divide your essay into subsections. So one strategy you can use for having a well-structured essay is you just write a bunch of stuff, and then at the end you sit back, first you take a day off, don't look at it at all, and then you look at it again and try to do what's called reverse outlining. So you're like, if I had to tell you what the sections of this essay are, could I do it? Can I tell you what the parts of the essay are? So you can do forward outlining where you like write an outline for your essay and then try to match that outline. You can also do reverse outlining where you just write a bunch of stuff and then afterwards try to figure out what the overall structure of it is. And then just tell me what you did found out in your reverse outlining stage. So you just put those subsections, use a bold headline or a bold title for your subsections and be like, in this part of the essay, I'm going to do this part of the essay. Yeah, okay. So recommended, not required, but it helps me understand what's going on, and it shows me that you know what the overall structure of your essay is. So those are just like general writing tips. Should include at least citations to at least 10 reputable scholarly sources, journal articles, books, anything that shows up on the U of T catalog. Don't cite me the URL where the book or item was retrieved. Just give me the scholarly version of it. And exactly one website will be considered a scholarly source, which is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That's the only one. That's the only one that I know that is peer reviewed. That is somebody wrote a thing and then somebody else checked it. I could jump on the web right now. I have access to a U of T website that's got my name on it and put a whole bunch of stuff up on it. Nobody checks it. Nobody makes sure that I'm being normal and sensible, right? So like, just that it's an academic website is not enough to establish that anybody's got a credibility, the normal kind of academic credibility. Because again, I could put some very bizarre claims on the internet like tonight, and that doesn't mean that they're correct or reputable or reasonable to cite, okay? But the Stanford Encyclopedia, somebody checked. So somebody writes something, and then another person who knows the topic says, aha, yes, that all makes sense and is reasonable. Okay, yeah.
So the workshop also said that any sources which are not mentioned in the course syllabus cannot be from the 10. So the 10 have to be exclusive of the ones which are given to us in class. Yeah,
I mean, that's a good strategy, yeah. Yeah, so that shows me that 10 isn't like what you've got for your own research. Yeah, yeah. Okay, other questions? The final essay. Okay, so please do get in touch with me if you've got any questions about this. Yeah. Okay. Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll move on to the course stuff. Right, so. Having already asked the question, what is philosophy, in the explanation for how to write your essays, we'll move on to a relatively more constrained topic, which is what's the relation between minds and bodies. So last time we were talking about the mind-body problem and the notion of dualism. I would just like to take a step back from this question and ask why we're even asking this question in a cognitive science class. Like ostensibly we're doing science in this class, right? Like that's the point of this class. The reason why we have to genuinely grapple with this is twofold. One, because we've got this kind of metaphysical tradition that comes out of Descartes that says the minds and bodies are fundamentally different kinds of things. And that metaphysical heritage that we're kind of stuck in and grappling with implies that we've got a felt sense, at least a strong felt sense, that there's something fundamentally mysterious about minds. And not just mysterious in the way that like quasars and protons are mysterious. There's lots we don't know about the physical world. There's a sense that kind of permeates the culture that mind is the kind of thing, minds are the kinds of things that are fundamentally unexplainable, fundamentally non-scientific. And if that's true, then this whole thing, this whole project is a non-starter, right? Like if mind is fundamentally beyond scientific explanation, then you don't get to have a science of the mind. That's just a tautology. So we have to investigate this thought that minds and bodies, so we can do science on physical things, everybody agrees with that, right? You can't do science on non-physical things. Does that premise work for you? Like, if you can't, the physical world is the topic of science, the non-physical world is just not eligible for scientific study. So it's true, if Descartes' thesis is true, that minds and bodies are a fundamentally different kinds of stuff, then there's no hope for mind science. There's no hope for cognitive science. You can study people, you can still do psychology because you can study people's behavior, right? So psychology, remember way back at the beginning we sort of sliced up the mind sciences and talked about their different aspects. You can still do brain science because brains are physical things. You can still do psychological science in the sense of studying people's reactions to stimuli. So you can do the external part, the behaviors that correspond to mental events. But if Descartes is correct and minds and bodies are fundamentally deeply separate, then you've missed in both the brain sciences and the psychological behavioral sciences the core essence of mind, right? The thing that makes it really mental is absent if Descartes is right. So your first person perspective, your conscious experience, right? You can have a body moving around and doing things, but if all you can access with science is the doing things, then you've missed the mental, conscious, experiential part of mind, which is presumably the important parts. So somehow we've got to respond to Descartes if we're going to have a science of the mind that gets what's important about minds. Okay. So last time we saw from Descartes a couple of arguments for dualism. We saw the argument that the two sets of properties, right? So physical things have extension, they take up space. Mental things don't take up space. Physical things have a location. Mental things don't have locations, like where are your thoughts exactly? Where is the thought that the sky is blue? Unclear. Physical things have no purposes, they have no intentionality, they have no aboutness. Mental things have purposes and goals and aboutness, and on and on and on, right? So two seemingly mutually exclusive lists of properties, and Descartes' conclusion is, well, these are just fundamentally different substances. And in philosophy speak, a substance means something that can exist on its own. So right now people are mostly physicalists. They believe that matter can just exist. Aristotle didn't think that was true. He thought you needed form and matter getting together for anything to actually exist. Descartes thinks that minds and bodies can both independently exist. So you can have a body without a mind. You can have a mind without a body. That's the other half of this, which is nice if you're hoping for immortality or life after death, right? If you're hoping that after your body dies, your mind continues on, Descartes' argument might give you some hope. And we also saw the relative certainty argument. That is the argument that I know my own first-person perspective directly. right? You have direct access to the contents of your consciousness. You have only indirect access to the world. If you've got different levels of certainty about two things, then those two things are not the same thing. That was how that argument went. And again, I mean, if there's any hope for the project of cognitive science, those arguments have to be in some sense flawed, right? We have to, that doesn't make them flawed. Like just because something is super important to you doesn't make it true, of course. Like the conclusion of the argument might be, yeah, too bad for cognitive science. But just so that we're clear on the stakes, Descartes' got to be wrong if the mind sciences are actually going to understand mind in the rich sense of mind. Okay. We also did the notion of qualia, a few more arguments for what was called property dualism, not substance dualism, but property dualism. The difference between substance dualism and property dualism is, of course, that substance dualism says there are two fundamentally different kinds of stuff. And then property dualism says, no. There's just one kind of stuff, but it's got two fundamentally different kinds of properties. And there's a failure of explanatory relations between those properties. So one kind of stuff, but it's got physical properties and mental properties. It's equally disastrous for mind sciences, however. So property dualism is equally disastrous because if what we're trying to do is understand how minds work, and all we have access to is the physical properties, and there's no explanatory relation between physical and mental properties, you still don't get a science of the mind. So equally, maybe less metaphysically controversial, equally disastrous for the project of trying to understand the mind scientifically. We did a couple of arguments for property dualism. The Mary in the room argument, that was the argument that you could have a person who just knows everything there is to know, physically speaking, about vision, but who's never seen the color red, and then they step outside and they see the color red, and they've learned something. Your intuition is supposed to be telling you that Mary, the vision scientist, has learned something, despite knowing all the physical facts. She's learned what it's like from a perspectival, in a perspectival way, in a kind of knowing by experiencing. She's learned something new when she sees the color red, what it's like to see the color red. And then we also saw the philosophical zombie argument, which is one of these, philosophy of mind is full of extremely science fiction-y thought experiments. If you love science fiction, you might like this. Actually, they're like hack science fiction. They're not even like well-constructed science fiction stories. Anyway, so the philosophical zombie argument was the following. It says, can you imagine the following? They're trying to trick you into imagining things. Can you imagine the following? An exact behavioral duplicate of a person who is, atom for atom even identical with a person. But one of them has conscious experience, has qualia, and one of them fails to have it. And if you can imagine that, the argument goes, then it's in some broad sense possible. And if it's possible that you've got identity of activity without identity of mind, then the behavior, the physical stuff, and the mental stuff are not essentially the same thing. The way our universe is set up, maybe they happen to go together in a very regular fashion, but you should conclude that because they are possibly separable, that means that they are not essentially the same. So here's another way of, go.
So the alternative then is that if you made an atom for atom copy of you and it didn't have consciousness, it would spontaneously generate it, basically.
That's right. Yeah, it wouldn't spontaneously, like fixing all of the physical facts about us. This argument suggests, the philosophical argument suggests, is not sufficient to fix all of the mental facts. So another way of putting this that we talked about was if once God's done setting up all the physical facts, does he have to do extra work to set up the mental facts or not? Or is setting up the physical facts fully sufficient for setting up the mental facts? Now, if you deny that that's possible, if you say, no, you simply can't have two identical beings, one of whom is conscious and one of them isn't, then you've denied the premise of the thought experiment, and now the argument doesn't run anymore. So, and that's what I'm going to make a case for when we talk about consciousness next week, basically that consciousness does something, that it's got a job, a physical, biological job for us. So this feeling, this vivid experience that you have of having a first-person perspective isn't just some extra thing that has no causal role in the universe. It's actually got a job to do for you as an organism. That's the case I'm going to try to make. That is very controversial, though. And to try to sum up the kind of structure of the arguments that make it controversial, you can do this kind of conceivability argument. So you say, look, for any given arrangement of matter, we can always ask, well, why is that arrangement of matter conscious rather than not being conscious? Right? Can't you imagine, can't you conceive of that physical arrangement of matter just not having a first-person perspective? So broadly, these are the conceivability arguments against or in favor of something like at least property dualism, if not substance dualism. Right. So, and again, so the way in which I'm going to try to get us out of this, I think these are arguments that need to be addressed. You need to think about them. At minimum, to dispel the kind of residual crypto-Cartesian aura that our culture has hung on to for the last few centuries, of the mind being just fundamentally, of consciousness being fundamentally unexplainable in physical terms. There are people philosophers who think about this stuff professionally who say, look, there's just simply no way of explaining, there's no way to defeat the conceivability argument. There's simply no way to explain why we're conscious rather than unconscious. And that motivates a variety of isms, including dualism, property dualism, panpsychism, which we'll look at in a little bit. A whole bunch of sort of like very bold metaphysical positions come out of the strength of conceivability arguments. So that's why we're wrestling with this. Okay. Good so far? So, here's one way that you can deal with this. So property dualism says minds and bodies are like the same basic stuff, but there are fundamentally different kinds of properties, one that's mental and one that's physical. So if the arguments that I've been giving you are correct, that means that there's this breakdown. There's no explanatory relation between mental and physical properties. Think about the zombie argument, right? So if it can be the case that you can have a person who's physically identical but mentally radically different, then you can't explain the mental in terms of the physical, right? Because the physical is not sufficient to bring about the mental. So if there's that breakdown of explanatory relations, why, you might ask? Why is the universe like this? Why is there this collapse of explanatory relatedness when you kind of expect things to have explanatory relations, right? Aren't things related in ways where you can explain one in terms of the other? Isn't that the way the universe is set up? And here's one attempt to answer that question. So in defense of dualism, you might say, no, actually, that's not how all properties are. So take, for example, time and space, or space and causality, time and causality, causality and time. Do you explain time in terms of space, or space in terms of time? Like, not really, right? At some point, the explanations end. You say, well, why is time different than space? And the answer is just sort of, that's just the way it is, man. That's just the way it is. Like, that's just the universe we find ourselves. Why are things causally related at all? I don't know. Those are just the elemental facts, elemental property dualism. These are just the elemental facts of our universe. Time is different than space. Space is different than causality. You explain lots of things in the universe, but it's certainly not the case that you explain every fact about it. You can ask questions to which modern science, there's nothing about mind in here, right? Those are not mental concepts. These are questions you could ask a physicist. And what would the physicist say? I don't know. Well, that's the way it is. Right? So any explanation, what you do when you have an explanation is you take something you understand. So you have something you want to understand, and what you do is you bring to bear something that you do understand to illuminate it, right? That's all explanations work. You have to start from something that you know about and use it to illuminate something that you don't know about. But that process assumes there's always something that you know about that's deeper than the thing that you want to understand. Why does helium balloons go up? Well, I'm going to cite the properties of gases. Well, why do gases like that? Well, I'll cite the property of atoms. Why are atoms like that? Cite the properties of particles. Why are particles like that? Quantum supersymmetry. Why is quantum supersymmetry like that? Now we have to say, I don't know. So, that's just a fact about explanation, right? It's a general fact about explanation. It's nothing that cognitive sciences bring to the table. It's nothing that the dualists have to like independently argue for. It's just, look, explanations end somewhere. There are just basic elements which we use to explain everything else. And maybe mind is like that. Maybe mind is just an elemental property of the universe. And what that gets you is what's called panpsychism. So panpsychism is the belief that every single bit of the universe has some mental aspect. Every atom, every electron, every neutrino screaming through the void has a mental aspect. So that's kind of odd, but people do defend this. Contemporary people do defend this idea. And it's a position that you might find yourself in if you take the mind-body problem very, very seriously. If you think, look, there's just no way of explaining due to things like the conceivability arguments, they call it the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness might be so hard that the thing to do is just to posit that mind is a fundamental aspect of the whole universe. Right? It's a property of elemental property. Dualism is just a basic property of physical matter. And then when we're conscious, all we're doing is kind of collecting and organizing the mental dimension of the matter that we're made of. What do you think? Huh? Huh? Panpsychists in the room? Nobody? Everybody? Yeah.
This feels a little bit inadequate.
Okay.
So going back to the conceivability argument, if you put a person in a fridge, all the matter is still there, but consciousness shuts down.
Eventually, yeah.
So that sort of gives a bound on what the scale of the consciousness is, like what
Right.
processes it involves.
Right.
Because if you put
Right.
a person in like a strong magnetic field, they're completely fine.
Mm.
So that's somehow maybe below the scale of
Right.
consciousness. So
Right.
the argument is every bit of matter that's maybe too small relative to what you might try and say the mind cares about.
Good. So yeah, so why is it that some pieces of matter, i.e. awake adult humans, seem to be conscious, and like asleep adult humans, or like humans just after they've passed away or something like that, why aren't they conscious? Does that mean that, like the mouse is conscious? Why? How is it, another question for I think that's exactly right. That's exactly the kind of things that I wouldn't want to be a panpsychist for. Sorry, I got two guys right in the row ask questions.
Another question would be like, which parts of the mouse would be conscious? Are
We're-
all conscious together?
Right.
Is just the scroll wheel conscious?
It seems like it would be the most conscious part, the scroll wheel. Yeah. So which bits are conscious and why? Yeah.
Well, I don't think panpsychism would say that all things are conscious. It would more say that everything has a mental aspect. So it's like the mouse has a mental aspect, but we don't understand that mental aspect. We understand consciousness, which is like an organization of mental aspects.
Aha, okay, so distinguish the mental from the conscious. And so humans are conscious, which is a kind of specific arrangement of mental aspects. So that's a good way of answering that query. And then the question that I have for that line of reasoning is, what do you mean by mental aspects if you don't mean conscious? if you don't mean cognitive and you don't mean conscious, what is it? How is it mental? And that's not to say that they couldn't give you an answer to that. It's just like for me, that's the next natural question.
Yeah, but then I would ask, like, how do you distinguish mental from material? Like, I
Yeah.
don't,
Yeah.
thinking about material seems like it's kind of just as obscure almost.
So yeah, that's right, and it's actually very hard to define materialism or physicalism, because you're like, well, all the stuff is. It's when people try to define physicalism, they say stuff like, well, I deny that anything supernatural exists. And you say, well, what do you mean by supernatural? You say, well, I mean non-physical. You say, well, but then your definition just went in a circle. So it actually turns out to be very difficult to define what you mean by physical. It's also hard to define what you mean by mental. That's true. Yeah. So it's all a big mess. There's a bunch of positions in this debate where I'm like, I don't know, maybe. So let's put this on the maybe pile. Yeah. One thing that for my money, the thing that would get us out of having to consider panpsychism is if you can give a good answer to the hard problem of consciousness. I take it that what motivates this view is that we're concerned about, like, how could there be consciousness in a physical world? And if you can give me a good answer to that, then this is a kind of unmotivated view. Now, to be unmotivated isn't to be incorrect, of course. That's not to say that it's wrong. It's just that it's hard to see a reason why you would posit it. Yeah. So, okay. No big takers on panpsychism. I'm sorry that I put up. It's kind of biasing the issue by putting up this like trippy image, because it's in some sense I like heaping scorn on panpsychism, which is not a nice thing to do. It's not really fair, but I don't know how else to represent visually the idea that all of the cosmos have mental aspects other than this. There are just thousands of pictures like this on the internet. If you're looking for pictures of like mind and cosmos, there's just a bucket loads of this style. Anyway, right. So, okay, so that's one way you can respond to this. And just to sort of like, I said this at the beginning, so I don't have to go over this a lot, but if any of these dualisms are true, you don't get to have a science of the mind. There is a permanent and unbridgeable explanatory gap, which, again, just because you want it to be true doesn't make it true. That would be disastrous for cognitive science, but sometimes disasters happen. Lots of purported sciences have foundered on the rocks of reality. So, like, maybe it's true. Maybe dualism is a correct explanation of the metaphysics of mind, and you'll just never have a science of the mind. I'm going to pursue the thought that maybe that's not true, and that we can have a science of the mind, just because that's the class that we're in. If that's a sufficient reason. We've only got 2 more weeks, so yeah.
Was that the stance when you took this course? You said it was much more negative.
So I think when I took the course, everybody, so it was presented, physicalism was presented as true. Physicalism was presented as the correct account of the metaphysics of reality. The reasons why they thought that mind was unexplainable were kind of the reasons we were talking about last week, which is the idea that intelligence is fundamentally a context, like rationality, human level cognition is fundamentally a context sensitive process. Science needs context insensitive things to be a science. Therefore, you can't have a science of human level intelligence. So it wasn't a metaphysical problem so much as a problem with what you can do science about. And I think at least part of that still stands up. Like, there are just things that you just can't do sciences about. History might be one of those things. So like, history is a whole bunch of quite unique events in unique contexts, and it's really, really hard, and professional historians don't want to do this, to extract generalities from history. And it could be that human history is just not the kind of thing that you can do a science about. You can study it. Historians exist, I assure you. They know lots of stuff about history that they can communicate to you in reasonably compact forms. But that's not to say that you can do a science of it. So that's like, it strikes me as not an absurd thing to say, but maybe we can nonetheless do a science of cognition. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, no, it wasn't dualism that was the problem. It was the intrinsic properties of intelligence that was supposed to be the issue. Yeah, but notice that that's sorry. This is something I'd meant to say. Notice that the issues that we're talking about right now are not cognitive in nature. They're not intrinsically cognitive. So when you imagine the philosophical zombie can solve insight problems exactly as well as I can, right? So it's able to do the cognitive stuff just as well as any human. The question is now about consciousness. So we've sort of shifted our question a little bit to consciousness. Now, if you can show, and I will try to show, that consciousness and cognition have something to do with each other, then you've shown that those are not fully separate issues. But right now we sort of shifted our question to the kind of first-person conscious experience and are crunching through that, trying to understand its metaphysics, rather than struggling with the cognitive side of things. Yeah?
For the philosophical zombie, are we saying that it has a brain and it's like identical in material fashion?
That's right.
Okay, but then can you also ask like, oh, can you conceive of matter without gravitation or something? Like, oh yeah, I guess I could conceive of it, but
Yep.
like, isn't it the same argument then?
So, okay, so this is, yeah, okay, so the conceivability argument, the shift from conceivable to possible is the most controversial part of that argument. It's the part I think doesn't work. But so Chalmers' argument goes like this. I can conceive of the philosophical zombie, therefore it is at least logically possible or metaphysically possible. So logical and metaphysical possibilities are the most broad. So I can imagine gravity being an inverse cube law rather than an inverse square law. That seems like it's metaphysically possible. It's not consistent with the laws of physics, but you can imagine different laws of physics that it would be compatible with. So that's metaphysical possibilities, a very broad sense. You can say, I can imagine, so in that same way, I can imagine matter without gravity. So that means that matter, gravitational attraction is not metaphysically essential to matter. Now, the move that I just made there again with gravity was I can imagine it, therefore it's possible. And you might not think that that's a good move. You might say, well, you think you'd imagined it, but did you? So a philosopher whose names escape me critiques this and says, look, yeah, I can imagine a naturally purple cow, but what I really missed out on was like, did I imagine how that evolved and how the proteins work that would support that? Did I like actually imagine through the details such that I know for sure that what I've imagined is a real possibility? Or did I just kind of gloss over all that and go like, purple, cow, put them together, sounds great. You know, like I can imagine an 18-sided cube. Like, well, if you don't think hard about it, yeah, you can imagine anything you want, but that's not really showing that it's possible in any important sense. So for my money, that's the slipperiest move in that argument. Is like, I can conceive of it, so it's possible. I'm like, well, how hard did you work on your conceiving of it? And in this case, especially in the zombie case, you'd have to say, well, I imagined the entire cognitive process. Well, no, you didn't, because we don't have a picture of the entire cognitive process, right? That's the whole thing that we're tripped up in right now. Like, we don't have a model of cognition, so you can't possibly tell me that you've got a detailed model of cognition that doesn't involve consciousness. That doesn't exist yet. So that's the, yeah. I'm often told that I shouldn't tell people what my opinions are on philosophical topics, and I cannot help myself, so you're stuck with me. Okay, okay. So anything else on dualism? Yeah.
If all particles, whatevers, have a fundamental mental aspect to them, couldn't you have several consciousnesses that are unaware of each other? And one of them actually gets to be you?
Yeah.
Like maybe your arm has thoughts on things, but that never really comes up?
Yeah. And like, I think that's the Carl Jung's model of the mind, something like that. Like, your mind is a swarm of conscious entities and your ego is just the one that you have access to or something like that. there's a theory of consciousness called the integrated information theory, which is current, and it says something like a system is conscious to the degree that it has a whole bunch of information that's integrated with itself. And one of the problems with that is that half of your brain has a bunch of integrated information and the other half also, so why aren't they both conscious? And they kind of just stick into the theory, the requirement that it's just the most integrated unit gets to be conscious as a whole. So like, I don't know, this has been, which is just to say, this is an issue in some theories of contemporary theories of consciousness. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's also a question, like, so why aren't me and the chair co-conscious? Why isn't this, so I'm touching the chair, we're now an integrated system. Why aren't me and the chair a conscious entity? If the chair has mental aspects, I have mental aspects, we are integrated, we're touching. Why aren't we conscious together? Where are the boundaries of my consciousness? Why do the boundaries of my consciousness end at my body and not at the air that surrounds me and the universe as a whole? Yeah, so open questions for the panpsychist. Yeah.
How do you know you're not conscious of the chair?
Well, if Descartes is right, so how do I know I'm not conscious of the chair? If Descartes' right, then I have direct access to my conscious experience, and I can't be wrong about it. So that means that if I don't think I'm conscious of the chair, then I'm not. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm thinking something like a prosthetic limb.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
can like move it with your thoughts.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Maybe it could be conscious.
It's integrated into your conscious awareness. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's some really interesting issues about where your conscious experience of your body is like a map that you've got. It's a sort of prediction about what's going to happen in your body, and odd things can happen to it. For example, prosthetic limbs, and the opposite, phantom limb syndrome. So if you lose a limb, you can continue to have a conscious experience of having that limb for months or years afterwards. A psychologist called Ramachandran has done tons of interesting work on phantom limb syndrome. And it can be quite painful. It's quite disturbing, actually. So some people experience they've lost their forearm and they experience a tightly gripped fist, like so tightly that it's painful. And they couldn't figure out how to do anything about it because the limb's not there. And the eventual solution was to have them stand in front of a mirror such that they can see their intact limb, and told them to move their two limbs in unity. So it looks like they've got the limb. And then when you relax the existing limb, the phantom limb relaxes as well, because you're interacting in a kind of feedback way with the phantom limb. So yeah, anyway. Yeah. Fascinating stuff can happen in the content of our consciousness. Okay. Digressions aside, let's look at some alternatives to dualism. So we did a few versions of dualism. We did good old-fashioned substance dualism from Descartes. We did property dualism, which is a sort of more modern version that people are more likely to defend. There's two kinds. There was like property dualism and elemental property dualism, where you say like, look, the mind is just part of the universe. We didn't really talk about predicate dualism because it's the worst kind of dualism, where you say, oh, we just have different ways of talking about mind and body. I'm like, yeah, obviously we do. Nothing follows from that, so it's not a very interesting position. Now let's look at some other things, some other isms, a lot of isms today, but monisms, that is the position that there's just one kind of stuff. We'll look at idealism, eliminative physicalism, reductive physicalism, and non-reductive physicalism, aka emergentism. So that's the plan for the rest of today. Let's quickly do idealism and then we'll take a break. So Berkeleyan idealism. Okay, before we do Berkeley though, remember that stuff about Malebranche and Leibniz, occasionalism and pre-established harmony? So after Descartes' like, yeah, you got minds and bodies, they're totally different kinds of stuff, and people are like, that's great, Descartes, how do they talk? And he says something silly. He says animal spirits. It's very unsatisfying. And everybody at the time was very unsatisfied. And then Leibniz says something. He says, yeah, okay, maybe it's a pre-established harmony, right? So you got mental events causing mental events and physical events causing physical events. And there's no actual causal relation between them, right? So I think I stubbed my toe and caused pain. And I think that that's a physical event causing my mental event. But I'm mistaken. There's no actual real causal connection between them. And Malebranche says something similar. He says, look, you think that there are necessary causal connections in the world, but actually, every time you think two things are causally connected, that's God stepping in. He takes the occasion to make it look like they're connected. So you shoot a cue ball at the 8-ball, and you expect the 8-ball to shoot off, but it could have just, you can imagine, right? You can imagine it just sort of stopping. So what makes that connection necessary? Well, it's God stepping in to make the world regular for us, right? So in fact, there's no causal connections between anything. No, except in God, right? So God is the only thing that causally connects anything. And a thought might have occurred to you, which is the following. Okay, so the pre-established harmony thing. I've just got a bunch of series of mental events. Well, why do you need the physical stuff in there? You've just got a series of mental events. They're not causally connected. So the fact that I think I moved the chair with my foot is uncorrelated to whether there's an actual chair there or not. That's the pre-established harmony. It looks to me like there is, but in reality, Leibniz says, no, there isn't. So in that story, why do you need the physical stuff at all? God set it up so that it looks like there's a physical world to you. Your mental life is full of things that look like they're physical objects. Why did God have to? So nobody's ever had an experience that's causally related to the physical world, ever. Nobody has that. So just dump the physical world. You don't need it. It's not a helpful part of the story. And that's basically Berkeley idealism. Yeah.
Well, physicists generally say that the events that occur in the world add information.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the physical world is like a storage system for mental events.
A storage system for mental events. But that assumes, so that's super plausible. That's a super reasonable thing to say. But it's not what Leibniz is not compatible with Leibniz's story, because it assumes that the mental events are causing physical stuff. They're causing changes in the physical stuff. This is the idea that, so like the physical world is just God's notebook for writing down so that all the mental events are properly correlated. He like writes down what everybody thinks is happening. Maybe. I don't know. This is, again, the maybe pile is very large here. You can put lots of ideas on the maybe pile and sort through them after the end of the universe when we know all the answers. But okay, so basically Berkeley idealism is just pre-established harmony without the physical side. It's just like everything looks like there's a physical world and there's not. And that sounds kind of anti-science, doesn't it? But in fact, his motivation, his actual argument for this position was empiricism. So what is it that you only ever experience? Mental events. Therefore, what's the only thing that you have evidence for? Mental events. The only thing you have direct experiential access to is your mind. The physical world is a hypothesis that you're positing beyond your experience. But if you think that you should stay close to, you're a good scientist, you don't think you should be speculating about hidden causes or whatever. Actually, you think you should stick as close as you can to the evidence that you've got, the empirical evidence that you've got. Well, the only evidence you've got is about mental events. So maybe everything is just mental. This is idealism. That is instead of Descartes, there's a mental stuff and physical stuff. There's just mental stuff. The whole world is made of ideas, experiences. Berkeleyism. Berkeleyan idealism. One concern that you might have is that I'm not currently having experience of the chair behind me. Therefore, is the chair really there? And not to worry, Berkeley says, God can still see it. Yeah. God is keeping everything in existence even when you're not looking at it, because God can see everything all of the time. So when you walk out of your living room, your couch is still there because God's watching. And that's Again, challenging for your explanation if you need God to do most of the work. Yeah.
How does this explain how my mental representations affect yours?
Like, God is coordinating things. So just like in pre-established harmony, God is keeping everything kind of like well coordinated. So you have the ideal impression of you, like I am saying words in class right now. And I have a corresponding mental experience of I am hearing words being said to me in class right now. There's just not and those are both true facts, right? Like you had a mental experience and then I had a mental experience. Those are true facts. Berkeley just says there's no physical world that had to go through to get us to both have those experiences. God just set it up such that your mental experience would be roughly correlated with my mental experience. Yeah.
What about people who are like schizophrenic or people who are like I don't know, some drugs? They're like seeing things that aren't actually there.
Well, that's super easy to explain. So people having different mental experiences or incompatible mental experiences is super easy to explain for Berkeley. It's just God doesn't have to constrain himself to get everything all connected all at the same time. Like he can allow some difference between the experiences. And there's no fact to this. So when you say, I'm having a hallucination, usually what that means is I'm seeing something that's not there. Well, if you're an idealist, there's no difference between, there's no physical facts to compare to. Like, there is no physical fact about what's really there. There's just the mental experience. And God is nice to us and tries to keep things pretty regular because that's how you know how to avoid sin and to move towards virtue. Like if things weren't pretty regular, you wouldn't know how to live a good life. So God's nice and he makes things kind of work regularly. But there is no fact of the matter to compare your mental experiences to. There's just the mental experiences. Yeah.
Feels like this reduces to the same problem though, because now just replace the word physical universe with God, and it's a very similar question you're trying to answer. Or if you like, you can say, okay, well, how does God's consciousness work? Let's figure that out.
Yeah.
In this argument, it seems like an equivalently difficult problem to figuring out human consciousness, because he just seems to be passing it off to God.
Yeah. There's a mind-body problem for God as well. So is God made of mind or matter? And if so, how do they interact? And I mean, one answer is just to do the idealist. So I think this makes it a little better than Descartes, so that we can say, look, everything's made of mind. God is made of mind. We're made of mind. So it's at least not two different kinds of stuff interacting. You don't have the interaction problem anymore. But you definitely have the question of like, okay, so what is consciousness? How does consciousness work? How does God consciousness work? How does any of this work? I mean, many questions remain for the Berkeleyan idealist. Yeah. So if the claim is this is not a satisfying account of mind, I tend to agree. Yeah.
So it's just basically the Matrix, but with God instead of
In some sense, I think the Descartes is a better version of the Matrix. Because for Descartes, there's a real world. Whereas for here, it's like the Matrix, but there is no real world with the robots in it.
Yeah.
Except God. I guess, no. So you say God is the robots.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, basically. But there's no, you can't get unplugged from this. There's, all that really is the mental world. Yeah. I hope that the Matrix is such a useful philosophical film. It's just such a useful example. I hope it stays current in the culture for a while, for like the rest of my career anyway, because it's super handy to have that. Yeah. So I think we're starting again. It's 2:14. Let's start again. So, but we can continue. This is good. So the question is like, is it possible that the multiple personalities are kind of zombie? And I more broadly, I think you can reasonably ask the question: could it be that people are ever philosophical zombies? So, for the thought experiment, it's not close enough to say that they're mostly like themselves. It has to be identical, completely indistinguishable. So there can't. So this is one. I think it's actually one of the weaknesses of the thought experiment. There would be no possible way to ever detect that somebody is a P zombie. So there can be, in principle, there can be zero evidence that somebody is a philosophical zombie. Now, even their own reporting, right? So I can stand here and stamp my feet and be like, I'm having a conscious experience. And I get mad. If you tell me I'm wrong, I get mad about it, right? I get feisty, I yell at you. But that's zero evidence, according to the thought experiment, that I actually am having a conscious experience, because my philosophical zombie would also stomp and pout, right? So it's according to the rules of the thought experiment, it's in principle impossible to ever have evidence that somebody's a philosophical zombie, which kind of makes you wonder, how do you have evidence that you're not a philosophical zombie? Which is a kind of creepy thought. But I take it that that's, in my way of thinking, that's just, you can just flip that on your head and say, well, that's just not, you just can't imagine, like, if there's no evidence that you are or are not a philosophical zombie, maybe that's just not a coherent idea. Like the idea of being a philosophical zombie is kind of unstable and nonsensical in that case. If there's just no possible way to detect it, no way to get evidence for or against it, it kind of doesn't hang together very well as an idea. But there certainly we can think about different, like, maybe consciousness as a function can go on and off. So if the argument that I'm going to give you, that consciousness does something, is correct, then you can certainly imagine that function being more or less present in a person, and sometimes failing, sometimes being odd, that kind of thing. So that's a slightly different argument, where if we're positing a function, then you can say, yeah, somebody who has sort of differences in their consciousness, you could detect that. If it's really doing something, if consciousness does something for us, then we can start to sensibly talk about differences in that function being performed. So does that, okay, good. Sorry, I saw Lexi, yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, like, in response to the multiple personality sort of thing,
Yeah.
how do you know that the other personality isn't also a conscious experience? Who says that there's any rule that a brain only gets one consciousness?
Yeah, so.
Having shown up with a different personality.
And the way that you would detect it is by differences in behavior or differences in the things that the people are reporting, all of which are supposed to be identical in the P-zombie thought experiment. So we can certainly talk about different structures of consciousness, and anybody who's done a bunch of introspection knows that consciousness is not a totally steady affair, right? Like, it has different qualities, different textures. You can do things with it and to it. It can change over time. So consciousness doesn't seem to be just it's not just an on or off property. It's not a completely stable property. Fortunately, because I'm so glad that my consciousness hasn't got the same structure as it did when I was 11, when I was a little jerk, right? Like, I'm glad now that I have more conscious awareness than I did then. I hope to have more conscious awareness as I age and develop. So, like, you know, thankfully, consciousness doesn't seem to be just like a steady, unchanging property of us. Okay, yeah, Jackson.
Are there people who think that they don't exist?
There are. So Anton syndrome, I believe, is the one where the person is convinced that they don't exist, or Cotard syndrome, where they think that they're dead. Yeah, there are such people. Yeah.
Maybe those are the P-zombies.
Maybe they are. Well, yeah. So, but then again, once again, if somebody says to you, "I am not conscious," that's a behavioral difference. So it's not satisfying the assumptions of the thought experiment that there's no behavioral difference. So maybe they wouldn't be P-zombies, but they might genuinely not be conscious. So if there is a difference between being conscious and non-conscious, and it's a difference in it's a biological difference between a conscious and non-conscious being, you can imagine somebody self-reporting that they're not conscious, because that's like, you can say that. You can, even if you're not having first-person experience, you can be like, I'm not having first-person experience right now, and it's freaking me out. Like, that's a conceivable thing, right? But not for a philosophical zombie. A philosophical zombie has got to be that they are exactly like a fully conscious person. Otherwise, the thought experiment, the argument that's supposed to come out of the thought experiment doesn't run. Yeah. Okay.
If someone thinks you don't exist if you're dead, then how do they understand the world or what they perceive as?
So there's Not rationally, I guess is the answer. I mean, there has to be at least some failure of rationality, but there's a wide variety of things that can happen to your conscious experience that people have this amazing ability, they call it confabulation. They'll tell a story about how it makes sense. So this, for example, this phenomena of, there's blind sight, where they're taking in information in their eyes, but they're nonetheless not conscious of the experience. But then if you ask them to guess what they're seeing, they'll get it right way more than chance. And if you tell them, hey, you can see, they will absolutely tell you that you're wrong. They will be fully convinced. And there's the opposite of that as well, where people have lost the ability to see. There's a bunch of what they're called anosygnosias. So an agnosia is a deficit in some aspect of your psychology. Anosognosia is the incapacity to recognize that you've been incapacitated. So people can lose their vision, but be fully convinced that they can see. And they'll just walk into walls and furniture, and you'll be like, look, you walked into that thing, you clearly can't see. And then we'll tell you a story about why they did that. Like, no, I wanted to walk into that. That was on purpose. I did that. I did that on purpose. So people are fantastic at generating a narrative about how what's happening to them makes sense. We are incredibly productive and fluent in that process. So people who believe that they're dead will tell you a story. They will tell you a story that sort of sounds like it makes sense. And what they're doing is just confabulating. They're generating, and this is maybe tells you something about cognition. People are amazingly good at making sense of themselves, of their experience. They will generate a story that makes it make sense, even if they have to deny very clear facts, like you're not able to see right now. They will tell you a story. They will nonetheless generate a story that makes their life a meaningful whole. So that suggests to me that cognition is more tuned up to find meaning in the world than it is to be rational, in some abstract sense of rational. I don't know. Okay. Okay, so enough of all that. Okay, let's move to, okay, I take it that this is, if you ask most people in a university setting, I don't think maybe not most people across the world, certainly not most people across history, but the kind of people that I go to parties with, this is their sort of default metaphysics of the universe. Here's what's in the universe, matter in motion. There's a bunch of matter and energy moving around, interacting in matter and energy ways. We call this physicalism. It used to be called materialism, but that has the implication of just physical matter. And of course, now we know that matter and energy are equivalent. So not just matter, it's matter and energy. So physicalism is supposed to be, look, the universe is just made up of one kind of stuff. It's a monism. There's only one stuff in the universe, physical stuff. And everything is to be explained ultimately in terms of that physical stuff. Now, how do we deal with the mind in this world? So there are a few different options for how you deal with the question of mind and consciousness particularly. We're going to go through three of them. We're going to go through first eliminative physicalism, then reductive physicalism, and then non-reductive physicalism. Okay, so eliminative physicalism, to start with, is the notion that actually there is no such thing as mind. So all of the things that you've said in your life, like I believe that the grocery store is open, that statement of belief was a mistake in some important sense. So describing your beliefs, describing your desires, describing mental events in general is a lot like the claim that Mary is a witch. So you say Mary is a witch, and people used to think that that was a real thing in the world, right? Witches are a real category of objects, and it can be true or false that Mary is a member of that category. Well, now we say, no, there's no such thing as witches, right? That's not a real, I mean, you can be a Wiccan, you can have that as your religion, but as in terms of like people who actually talk to spirits to cast magical spells, most people, especially physicalists, say that's not a real thing. Similarly, the eliminative materialist says minds are not real things. They are stories that we've told ourselves to try to make sense of the world. When we have a properly worked out science of the brain, what we'll be talking about are neural events. So instead of saying I'm hungry, you'll in the sense of like I'm having the mental, personal conscious experience of hunger, you'll say something about your brain. That's what they're sort of arguing. I think as far as I know, there are very few eliminative materialists in the philosophy literature. It's not a super popular position. So I'm going to stick somebody with it. I'm going to pin this position on somebody, despite the fact that it might not be completely appropriate. This is what we do in philosophy. If there's a view that's so odious that nobody defends it, we'll just sort of like foist it on somebody and then beat them up for it. So Gilbert Ryle is actually kind of against, Ryle in general in his overall writing is kind of against doing metaphysics. What we're doing right now is metaphysics, by the way. We're doing the question of like, what is in the world really? And Gilbert Ryle says, you probably shouldn't do metaphysics. He's a Wittgensteinian. Wittgenstein says, you know, metaphysics, it's kind of a mistake to even be doing that. So Ryle is kind of in that camp. Nonetheless, he defends what's called logical behaviorism. So logical behaviorism, interpreted as a metaphysical doctrine, is in an eliminative materialist position, or limited physicalist position. So we're gonna foist this position on Ryle and then show why he's wrong about it. Okay. It's a rough world, philosophy. It's a rough world. Okay. Let me develop the idea and then try to show you that it's probably not wrong, or probably not right. So one of the things that Ludwig Wittgenstein said was the job of philosophy is to get us out of the bewitchment of language. So language can trick you. I hope that that's clear. Language can confuse you into thinking that something that looks like a problem is really a problem when it isn't. So here's a couple. What time is it on the sun? Noon. Yes, it's always noon on the sun. High noon. It is extremely high noon on the sun. Time of day, at least, is a function of the Earth rotating around the Earth, right? Or around its axis. And that question, so what time is it on the sun, doesn't actually make sense. What's north of the North Pole? So we get the North Pole here. What's north of the North Pole? Sounds like it should have an answer, right? Sounds like a perfectly reasonable question. It's not, though. It's a question that it's grammatically well-formed. There's nothing wrong with the sentence as a sentence. It sounds sensible, but nonetheless, it's a poorly framed question. So he thinks that the question, what is mind, is fundamentally like the question, what is north of the North Pole? That is, you're asking about something that isn't real. You're asking a question that is just linguistically confused, and that if we can get you unconfused, you'll not have an answer to the question, you'll stop asking the question. So lots of questions. This is one of Wittgenstein's great sort of philosophical contributions, was pointing out there's lots of questions that you don't need answers for, you need to stop asking. And maybe what is the mind is one of those questions. Okay, so believing, I believe that it's Tuesday, is a verb. The place in the sentence that belief occupies is the verb place in the sentence. Now that makes it sound like it's an action. Running is a verb, running is something that you do. Jumping is a verb, something that you do. Believing is a verb that makes it sound like it's something that you do. And this is where we get confused, Ryle says. Maybe that's incorrect. Maybe thinking of belief as an action, the word believing is a verb, but thinking of belief as an action is probably not correct. So, for example, does everybody here believe that Africa is a continent? Yes? Good, good. That wasn't the hard part, okay? Okay. Now, what time of day this morning would you say that you started believing that Africa was a continent? Right when you woke up? Just now. Just now. Maybe it was just now, right? But didn't you believe before just now that Africa is a continent? Surely you did. If I'd asked you an hour ago, do you believe Africa is a continent? You'd be like, yes, yes, of course. Why are you asking me that? Do you have to keep saying it to yourself to continue to believe it? Do you walk down the street, Africa's a continent, Africa's a continent, Africa's a continent, right? It's not something that you have to do. To believe that Africa's a continent is not something you have to continue to do all day long to continue to have the belief that, in fact, Africa's a continent, right? Perhaps, so it's weird to think of it as an action in the normal sense of action because most of the day you don't do anything about most of your beliefs. Think of how many beliefs you have, a lot. So how many things how many sentences do you think I could pose to you where I'm like, do you believe this? You're like, yeah, of course I do. But you might have never had the thought in your life, right? So, you know, yeah. So I won't try to, I'll leave it as an exercise of the reader to come up with absurd things that you nonetheless believe. There are no chairs on Jupiter. Do you believe that there are no chairs on Jupiter? No, I'm seeing no's. There are chairs on Jupiter?
We've discussed chair being equal definition.
Okay. There are no squirrels on Mars. Let's try that one. Some doubt. Fair enough. Nonetheless. Okay, so maybe belief is not like an action in the sense that you have to constantly be doing it in the way that if I'm not actively running, I'm not running, right? Whereas if I'm not thinking the sentence, Africa's a continent, I nonetheless continue to believe it. Maybe a better way of thinking about beliefs is a kind of disposition. So dispositions are like salt has the disposition that if you put it in water, it will dissolve, right? Glasses have the disposition of, I love using this thing as an example. For some reason, I'm always using the water bottle as an example. It's meltable. So if you put it under high enough heat, it would melt, right? But maybe that's never going to happen, right? It seems like a reasonable thing to think that this bottle will never be melted, but nonetheless, it has the disposition of being meltable, right? So maybe beliefs are like dispositions. So you have the disposition where if somebody, for really bizarre reasons, asks you if you believe that Africa's a continent, you go, yeah. So the disposition is not an activity that you're constantly doing. It's a thing that it's a likelihood of responding in some way to a given input. And this is behaviorism. If you recall the psychological theory from the 1950s, behaviorism is the idea that you can do all the psychology that you want to do is just about inputs and outputs. If I give a rat the following stimulus, they'll behave in this way, right? So behaviorists characterize psychology entirely in terms of input-output relations, right? Stimulus and response. Ryle is trying to make the argument, when you say beliefs are dispositions, what you're saying is the belief can be characterized in terms of input-output relations. Say, if somebody asks you, name all the continents, Africa's likely to come up. If somebody asks you, are there squirrels on Mars? I'd say in this room I would give it a 90% chance that you'll say yes. There appears to be some doubt about that. So dispositions rather than activities. And that makes but think about what the disposition is. It's not a hidden internal state, right? So the tendency is to think about beliefs in terms of, like most people's tendencies, to think about beliefs as something inner, hidden, private. If Ryle's analysis is correct, then beliefs are entirely a public affair. That is, the input, me asking you, do you believe Africa is a continent, is public, right? Your output, nodding or saying yes, is public. And that's all there is to belief. That's what beliefs are. A disposition to behave, which is not an internal, mental, hidden thing in your own private realm. It's a thing that you do in public. And I mean, it's not entirely implausible, is it? Like, we will sometimes override people's claims to believe things based on their behavior. So you've got a friend who never goes out at night, constantly carrying a crucifix and a stake, has a big garlic necklace that they're constantly wearing, surrounded by mirrors all the time. And they're like, but I don't believe in vampires. And you go, you do though. You do. I don't care what you say, and I kind of don't care what you think. You got all of the behavior of somebody who believes in vampires, so you believe in vampires, right? So in some circumstances, we're willing to override people's even sincerely stated kind of like claims about what they believe if their behavior shows the right sort of dispositions. Right? If you say, I'm not afraid of cats, and then I flash a cat picture at you, and you go, ah! That's, right? So Ryle's claim is that we can do a kind of complete analysis of mental states in terms of dispositions to behave, given certain inputs. So given these inputs, I behave this way, and that's what the mental state of belief is. That's the claim. So in this sense, he eliminates the mental dimension as a separate dimension. So there's just the disposition to behave. That's what it is. So he's eliminated the internal mental dimension in favor of public external displays. Ta-da! Now you don't have to worry about minds anymore. It's great. Okay. Let's see. Anything else to say about him? Yeah, so therefore there's no mind-body problem. There's no minds, no mind-body problem. You can do psychology. This is a great, I mean, you can study the mind in the sense of studying how people behave. That's the whole behaviorist psychological project. So, hooray. Okay, before I dive into, I'm going to criticize this now. Any worries about this before I dive in? Yeah.
So he just doesn't have anything to say about the fact that like we have internal conscious experiences that we describe as a mind. Like just saying the word mind doesn't describe anything feels profoundly unsatisfying because we use the word mind to describe something.
So he'll do, yeah. I mean, I agree. Yeah. But like, so he's again in the tradition of Wittgenstein, who's like, Wittgenstein's very critical of the notion that, for example, language is supposed to be something internal. So you might have the impression that what you're doing when you use language is describing some inner state of being. But like, for example, his big example is pain. How did you learn to use the word pain? Well, you saw how people behaved when they were in pain, and when you behaved in some ways, they told you that that's what pain is. So everything that you know about how to use the words that you've got is entirely based on public facts, right? Things that are shared, interpersonal things, which is what language is for. It's for connecting with other people. So when we describe our inner mental states, like, you can only describe anything with language, and language is a public fact. So in some sense, the stuff that's supposed to be inner is either publicly accessible or beyond language. So when I try to tell you what it's like for me to see green, I can point to green things, which is a public behavior, but I can't communicate my inner experience, can I? And one way of dealing with this is just say, well, you're just wrong about having the inner experience. You're just wrong about that. I don't know if Ryle is going that far, but that's one way of responding. I agree. This is a profoundly unsatisfying account of. So let me give you some reasons why I similarly find this profoundly unsatisfying. It works okay for beliefs, this dispositional account. How about imagine? Okay, so imagine a sailboat with blue sails. Try it. Okay? Now imagine a sailboat with red sails. Okay? So now the stuff that I did with you about Africa as a continent doesn't apply anymore, does it? I'm like, oh, when did you start believing that? Well, actually, you started imagining the sailboat with red sails shortly after I said so, or I asked you to, and you finished whenever your mind drifted off that topic, right? So that's more like an activity than believing, isn't it? Imagining something does seem like something that you actively do. You start and stop. It's something that occupies some of your mental resources. You can't just imagine you can believe huge numbers of things without ever worrying about them during your day. You can't just imagine things without it occupying some of your resources, right? So imagining seems like much more aptly described as an activity than believing. Here's what Ryle says imagining is. He says, imagining is, and I quote, actively expecting not to see something. So so you're trying to imagine what he would say about how do you cash out the activity of imagining in terms of dispositions to behave? And he says, well, you're actively expecting not to see a sailboat with blue sails. And I don't know what that means. That sounds like nonsense to me, personally. Yeah. So, it seems like not nearly as nice of an analysis. This is logical behavior. The broad view that he's defending is logical behaviorism. And he's right, of course, that sometimes language does bewitch us. I don't want to deny that that's a fact about experience, like what's north of the North Pole. That's an example of it sounds like that's a real problem, and it's not. But that's not to say that language every problem that we have is a linguistic confusion. That's not to say that you can never overturn the way that we use language given facts, right? So as new facts come in, we sometimes have to restructure our language rather than the other way around. Ryle was part of a tradition, again, started with Wittgenstein, of people doing what's called ordinary language philosophy, where you're like, look, just get out of your philosophical confusion by returning to the facts that you can observe and the normal sort of way of speaking, and you'll get out of having to do metaphysics or whatever. But that doesn't always, it's a good strategy for a whole lot of problems, but I'm not sure that it's a strategy that always works. So just insisting on the ordinary way people speak is not always sufficient to get you out of your trouble. So, for example, imagine somebody in the 14th century, so the 1300s, saying, look, here's my argument for why it has to be the case that the Earth is the center of the universe. All of our location talk is relative to the Earth, right? You say go north. You say go 20 miles east, right? So all of our descriptions of where you are in the universe assume the Earth as the fixed center of things. Therefore, it's impossible, it's conceptually a mistake to even imagine that the Earth could be going around the sun. Because it's built into our language. Our very notion of location is built around the Earth being a stable position, the stable sort of reference point for position in the universe. You say, well, yeah, that's how people talk, but they're wrong. That's not how location, yeah, that's how our language describes things, But that just shows that the language needs to be changed. It needs to be updated given the facts. Not that you should always accommodate yourself to how people speak, but that sometimes how people speak needs to be modified to accommodate the facts. So Ryle's style of analysis is to say, look, we just pay attention to how people speak, and that's how we should proceed. And you might say to him, yeah, but sometimes people talk wrong. Sometimes the assumptions of people's language need to be modified rather than modifying our assumptions to match the language. Yeah. Another issue, we'll do 2 more issues and then leave this. So, like, it's very hard to say what the dispositions associated with various beliefs are. So suppose that I have the belief that it's raining out. Does that mean that I'm disposed to bring an umbrella? Maybe. Lots of people do. But like, as a younger man, I found it, I liked being rained on. It's like, I do still like being rained on. I'm more practical now, especially now that I didn't have a cell phone in my pocket at the time. So there was sort of no practical consequences to being soaking wet. But like, and I liked, it's like being rained on is like the sky touching your head. It's nice. It's great. It's a very pleasant experience if you don't care about being soggy afterwards. So for me, the belief that it was raining was uncorrelated. I didn't even own an umbrella. It's uncorrelated with the disposition to pick up and employ an umbrella. So unclear what the connection is between the belief and the disposition to behave. And people are extremely unpredictable in this regard, and this was one of the things that collapsed the behaviorist psychological research program, is that people don't have reliable input-output relations. Like, it's not the case that a given input reliably generates a given output. People have these complex internal states that makes that mapping very, very nonlinear. It's not just input, therefore output, right? It's input, rich inner life, and then whatever output you have based on that rich inner life, yeah? So the dispositions associated with various beliefs are extremely unclear, and there doesn't seem to be any principled answer except positing a mind. So you might say, well, actually, the dispositions of my behavior are very clear based on my mental activity. And that's right. That's right. Given a picture of your mind, your internal representations of the world, your rich inner mental life, yeah, you can tell me, like, given some situation, what you'll do. But that's just to give up the game here, right? So Ryle's thing was try to eliminate the internal states. He wants to reconstruct the mind entirely in terms of publicly available inputs and outputs. And if you have to say, yeah, I can tell you what output I'll do given an input if you allow me to cite my complex inner mental life, then that's just saying, that's just giving up the position that Ryle's trying to defend. So there's that. There's also, Hillary Putnam's got this fun argument against this called the superactive actor super Spartan problem. So if the disposition to, so the experience of pain, for example, very vivid one, of course, Ryle wants to reconstruct the experience of pain entirely in terms of dispositions to do things like go, ow, and stop it, right? That's what he wants pain to be. But of course, you can imagine somebody who's an exceptionally good actor enacting all of the behavior of being in pain. They're crying, they're flinching, they're doing all of the pain behaviors perfectly. Imagine them doing it perfectly, indistinguishable from a person actually in pain. Ryle has to say, that person's in pain. And you can imagine the super Spartan. Let's suppose that Spartan just in the sense of not in being in a quasi-fascist city-state, but in the sense of being very uncommunicative of your inner states. So the thing that they were most famous for before they got famous for having 8-packs was that they didn't display if they were in pain. So they had no facial expression, they didn't react or respond. So you can imagine somebody who's incredibly trained not to respond to pain. Nonetheless, it seems like they could be in pain, right? even if you have zero response, you're nonetheless in pain. Whereas for Ryle, they have to say the super actor who's feeling no pain is actually in pain, and the super Spartan who's actually in pain is not feeling pain. So that seems to be, there really does seem to be a fact of, and so you don't have to very seriously imagine these people. You just have to notice that there's a big disconnect between the amount of behavior that you produce for a given mental state and the mental state. Like, you can be in a lot of pain and not show it. You can act like you're in pain and not really be in pain, like actors do. So, enough of Ryle, yeah? Okay, so we've fully defeated this guy from the 50s who probably didn't think that anyway. No. He did defend logical behaviorism as a position. It's not clear that he defended it as a metaphysical account of mind rather than a linguistic analysis of our mental speech, but nonetheless it does seem to fail as an analysis. Okay, so eliminative materialism, that was the one where you're like, there's no such thing as minds. Let's go to a somewhat more plausible picture now. I think the real debate here, the debate that I'm most compelled by personally, given my history, is the debate between reductive physicalism and non-reductive physicalism. So both of these groups believe that there's just one kind of stuff in the world, matter and motion, matter and energy moving around. And the reductive physicalist says minds exist. We do need an answer to the mind-body problem. We can't just say that it's a non-problem, but minds are really just aspects of bodies. So they reduce minds to bodies. So to reduce something is to say, I can explain everything about the first thing. So to reduce A to B is to say I can explain to you everything about A in terms of B. So like, if you want to reduce, for example, life to matter, you say, look, I can tell you everything there is to know about life in terms of molecules. That's a relatively recent view, actually. So as of the 1800s, biologists were taking seriously the idea that there's some kind of élan vital, an essence of life that's over and above the molecules of the living thing. Now, that's an extremely unpopular view, at least among scientists. They say, no. Everything that there is to know about living things, I can explain to you in terms of biological or molecular facts. Right? There's nothing that I cannot reduce about life down to molecules. A reductive physicalist says the same thing about minds. They say, yes, minds exist, they are real things, but everything that you need to know about minds, you can explain in terms of matter. That's the picture. Consider the quote-unquote folk theory of lightning and the scientific theory. A bit obnoxious the way philosophers use this folk theory talk a lot. It's a slightly obnoxious way of speaking, but that's how they talk. So there's lightning. We've known that there's lightning for quite some time now. We haven't had much of an explanation for what lightning is until approximately Ben Franklin, I think he was the one who figured it out, that it was electricity. Yeah? So people knew about electricity at that time. They could produce it in the lab. They can use it to do stuff. So they're working out the theory of electricity. And then Franklin says, here's my theory about lightning. It's just electricity. He's certainly not saying there's no such thing as lightning, right? That's not the claim at all. He's not saying lightning is a figment of your imagination. He's saying lightning is a very real thing that I can explain to you in terms of electricity. All of the facts about it are facts about it as an electrical phenomenon. That's the reductive move. So lightning is reduced to electricity. You can do the same thing with heat. So what is heat? We used to believe, the royal we, I wasn't alive yet, heat was explained in terms of a subtle fluid called phlogiston. So phlogiston, if I touch something cold, there's this fluid that's in my warm hand that flows to the cold thing. It's this sort of subtle fluid that moves from one object to another. You can explain quite a lot of the phenomena of heat using the theory of phlogiston. Now, of course, we don't think that the heat is some extra substance anymore. Well, now we think it's, of course, molecular motion, right? So how quickly are your molecules bouncing around? So heat has been reduced to the kinetic energy of molecules. Yeah? So long history of giving reductive explanations in science. It's one of the things science is best at. Taking things apart into their parts, figuring out what the relevant parts are, and then explaining the overall phenomena in terms of the parts. It's a magical thing when it works, explaining the world reductively. And it happens all the time, and it's great when it works. So let's consider what's called the identity theory of mind. So the identity theory suggests that something similar is going to happen between mental properties and physical properties. It's not that we do the thing that Ryle suggested, that we eliminate minds. Rather, minds will be reduced to physical properties sometime in the future. Identity theory is always a kind of promise about what's going to happen. Now, clearly we don't currently have a complete story about how minds work in terms of brains yet. But the identity theorist says, once we have the things all worked out, that's where we'll get to. It's not happened, but it's happening, or it's on the horizon. So why should we think that identity theory is true? So some really compelling arguments actually for identity theory. So here's one. You got a mind, but you came from purely physical processes, assuming that everything we know about how embryos grow and develop is true, right? We, as a species and as all living things, ultimately came about from physical processes, right? I mean, this is, again, these are assumptions within the scientific worldview. If you're of a religious worldview, you don't share these assumptions, so this argument is not going to work for you. But given the assumptions of the scientific worldview, we're assuming that you got here via embryonic development into a baby, into a person, or into an adult, sorry. That we evolved, that ultimately some non-living pattern of chemical interactions gave rise to simple life, which gave rise to complex life, which gave rise to us. So we came from physical processes. And just from the today point of view, we're actually having a lot of success at explaining mental stuff in terms of brain stuff. Like the process of trying to understand minds in terms of neuroscience is well advanced, actually. It's not that there's nothing to say about that. There's tons of stuff to say about that. There's tons of stuff. If you've taken Psych 100, you've seen lots of this style of explanations. You say, why is my mind doing this? Well, here's why. Brain facts. So to the extent that you can give facts about the brain that explain facts about your mental life, that's a really good argument for the identity of those two domains, right? Well, it's an argument anyway. Okay. So identity theory says minds just are brains, identical with brains. Let's look at some quick problems for identity theory. So if you're trying to understand a system, reductive explanation is a very good way of doing it a lot of the time. But a lot of philosophers have pointed out, especially people who do this kind of thing, you don't always get a better explanation by going to a lower level of understanding. So right now I'm not trying to argue for dualism or any of the weird ones. This is an argument for what's called non-reductive physicalism. So still on the track of thinking that there's only matter and motion, but now the question is, do we understand the mind by identifying it with and reducing it to the brain? Or do we have an independent science of the mind at the level of minds? So again, I think I used this one before, but suppose you want to understand the game of chess. Is the best strategy to spend to take one of these pawns and slice it thinly and put it under a very powerful microscope and try to map out the pattern of wood grain in the pawn. How much is that going to help you understand the game of chess? Zero, none. That's not a good way of understanding chess, right? That's bad. That's a bad strategy for understanding chess. Why? Well, one reason is chess is multiply realizable, isn't it? So it doesn't matter that it was made of wood. It could easily have been made of marble or plastic or whatever. Same game. So understanding the parts of this system in terms of their like micro constituents gets you nowhere in terms of your project of understanding the system as a whole. This is a line of thought sort of famously presented by Hilary Putnam. Putnam asks the following question, the following profound philosophical question. Why does the square peg not go through the round hole? Now, certainly you could give an explanation at the quantum level. You could give an atom by atom, quark by quark description of the properties of the peg and the properties of the hole, or the board that the hole exists in, presumably. Right? You could give that explanation. It's not an explanation. Which is to say, it is an explanation. Here's another explanation that you could give, however. Assuming an equal radius for the square and the hole, the square does not pass through the hole. Sort of broad geometric explanation. That was also an explanation, right? The thing that I just said to you? Okay. So explanation one is wildly specific, incredibly long, and cites a bunch of stuff that isn't actually necessary to the situation. So one of the things that we want out of our explanations is that they should be general, right? They should apply widely. That's way back at the beginning of the course we talked about sort of convergence and multi-aptness. So the quark by quark description of the situation isn't super multi-apt. And if you swapped out a different peg, you now have to generate a whole new explanation. Or if the peg and the hole are made of plastic or concrete, you have to generate a whole new explanation unrelated to the first explanation that you gave, because it's an entirely different set of quarks. Whereas the basic geometry applies across those different explanations. The basic geometry is multi-apt in a way that Putnam doesn't use the word multi-apt, he uses generality, but the second explanation is profoundly general in the way that the first explanation is not. It's the chessboard thing again, where understanding the system, the right level of understanding for the system seems to be, rather than at the level of the parts, at the overall organization of those parts. So that leads us to what's called non-reductive physicalism, or emergentism. The idea that, yes, there's only physical matter in play, there's nothing else involved, it's not some other sort of stuff, but nonetheless, it's not always going to be at the reductive sort of the level of the parts at which the best explanation exists. Should we take a break or plow through? Hands up for take a break. Hands up for plow through. Sorry, break people. A lot more votes for plow through. Okay, so we'll make it quick. Okay, so there's some versions of non-reductive physicalism that are sort of emergence that are totally trivial. So there are some properties that the whole vase has that none of its parts have. So imagine that the whole vase is like a kilo. None of its parts are a kilo, right? So lots of cases in which there's simply facts about the whole that are not facts about any of the parts. That's pretty trivial and obvious. It's not that nobody would disagree with that. The controversial part is the claim that there are facts about the whole that are not reducible to facts about the parts. That's the non-reductive physicalism part of this. In some sense, it's Aristotle's old question. Aristotle poses this: is the whole more than the sum of its parts? So literally, the weight of the vase is the sum of the weight of its parts, is in no sense more than the sum of its parts. So the controversial bit is, are there ever wholes that are more than the sum of its parts, or different than the sum of its parts? This position has a sort of historical lineage. I always like doing the historical lineage. The British emergentists, like, for example, C.D. Broad, argues that there are lots of physical systems that are more than the sum of their parts. So, for example, we talked about how sodium is explodey and chlorine is poisony, but sodium chloride is delicious. You can think about how oxygen, pure oxygen, molecular oxygen, has a, well, actually, like, yeah, so pure oxygen has a melting point, a boiling point way, way below 0 degrees Celsius. Pure hydrogen has an even lower boiling point. You get them together and their boiling point is 100 Celsius, right? So it's not just the additive sum of the boiling points of the two, it's a nonlinear summation. It is not, and a nonlinear summation is to say, it is not the, literally speaking, sum of its parts. So tons of physical systems seem to have, in at least a literal sense, properties as a whole that are not the sum of their parts, like literally the sum of their parts. This was an extremely convincing argument for emergence back when people sort of insisted that the laws of nature should be linear in nature. We discussed in the self-organization stuff where like linear laws of nature were kind of the only sort you could tolerate back when you had to do everything by hand, because it's unbelievably difficult to solve nonlinear equations by hand. Now we've got computers that can do the kind of like numerical methods for dealing with nonlinear equations. So we're kind of okay now with nonlinear laws of nature, and this argument is not as convincing. It's not as compelling an argument when you're like, yeah, well, it's not the literal sum of its parts, sure, but it's in some sense a product of the properties of the parts. That's the sort of weakness of this as an argument now. But we've got sort of more sophisticated modern versions of this. So for example, we talk about the difference between weak emergence and strong emergence. This is the reading for today, I believe. Chalmers on weak emergence and strong emergence. So weak emergence, I sometimes call this epistemic emergence, is the idea that you can't explain the whole in terms of its parts, or rather the best explanation of what's going on at the level of the whole is better than the best explanation at the level of the parts. This is an explanatory notion, it's an epistemic notion, it's a notion about what's the best level of understanding. Strong emergence is a much stronger claim. It's the idea that the whole actually exerts new forces or powers over its own parts. There are people who think this. So what strong emergence requires is what's called downward causation. So this is actually like the organized whole exerts forces on its own parts. Like the tornado, imagine the tornado actually manipulating its own atoms in some way. So this is like new physical forces emerging once this complex system gets going. There's, I think, pretty good arguments against strong emergence in this sense. So this is just really briefly Jaegwon Kim's quite famous argument against it. He says, look, okay, so we got P1 going to P2, so some physical state going to some other physical state, and let's say M1 to M2, this is some mental state going to some other mental state. And those upward arrows are just like the physical stuff is realizing the mental stuff is realized in the physical stuff. So these are your conscious experience, M1 to M2, P1 to P2 is like what's going on in your brain. Okay, so Kim says, look, there's a complete causal story from P1 to P2. The whole, you can give a molecule for molecule, quark for quark explanation of what's going on in your brain. And there's pretty convincing empirical arguments from like conservation laws that that's going to be true. So this story is complete in and of itself. You could just tell that story. So, but strong emergence would be something like M1 causing P2. M1 reaching down into its own parts and affecting P2 in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise been just given P1. But that's bizarre because we just said that the story from P1 to P2 is complete already. So there's no extra work to be done by the higher level stuff. Right? There's no space in this system for M1 to contribute anything to P2. This is Kim's argument. Anyway, very briefly, this is Kim's argument against downward causation. Look, there's just nothing. There's no room in the transition. So P1 is already sufficient for P2. That means there's no extra work for M1 to be doing. So he thinks downward causation is incoherent as an idea. That's his claim. Downward causation, at least in the sense of efficient causes. Remember we saw Huarero though, so just to link this back to the self-organization stuff. Huarero says, here's the sense in which the whole affects its parts as a constraint. So that's a sense in which the whole can cause the parts to do stuff, but not cause in the pushy-pulley sense. Cause in the sort of formal constraints sense, yeah? And that's not affected by, so Kim's argument rules out the pushy-pulley kinds of downward causation, but not the constraint kind of causation. Okay. So, we're almost done, hang on. So, on the weak, so that was strong emergence, the idea that the whole literally exerts forces on its own parts, that the whole in some sense reaches down and causes changes in its own parts. Kim's argument is generally speaking a pretty well accepted one that that's not possible. But there's another sense of emergence, weak emergence, and that's characterized in a bunch of different ways. Chalmers characterizes it in terms of like, are you surprised by what the whole system does given the way its parts behave? I think that's a pretty weak way of characterizing it. Mark Bedau gives a stronger way, which is something like this. Look, if you have to simulate the parts step by step, right? So the only way of understanding what the whole system is going to do is by actually grinding through a simulation of everything that goes on and then looking at what the end result is. Then in some, and not just that we don't know how to do it otherwise, but imagine there's no other way of predicting what the whole is going to do from the parts, right? Imagine the situation where the only way of doing that is by grinding through a simulation. He says that in some important sense, in some objective sense, that makes the whole unpredictable from the parts. Unpredictable in the sense that there's not a general explanation of why the whole is the way it is from the parts. A simulation is an incredibly specific way of doing a prediction, right? A simulation takes you through one set of possibilities at a time. So if doing the simulation is the only way of predicting, then you don't have a general explanation of the whole from the parts. And if you want general explanations, that might tell you that the best explanation is at the level of the whole. So, okay, the main picture here is that there's emergence in the sense of strong emergence, which is kind of implausible, but there's also emergence in the sense of unpredictability of the whole from the parts. You can't tell in advance what the whole is going to be like by looking at the parts. And you can give that a kind of strong reading through stuff like Mark Bedau's requirement of simulation. Yeah? Okay. So just to kind of sum this up, if what we want from our explanations is generality, then it seems possible to say that some high-level explanations are better then they're low-level explanations. That was the peg in the board example, right? And that's supposed to be the kind of point of the Mark Bedau's weak emergence stuff, where there exists some systems where the best explanation is at the level of the whole, even if there is an explanation at the level of the parts. There is some extremely long and complicated explanation at the level of the parts, but if there's a really short and sweet and general explanation at the level of the whole, then we might say that it's emergent in this weak sense, in this epistemic sense. So perhaps if the mind is, for example, multiply realizable, then the best explanation of the mind is not going to be in terms of the smallest parts of your brain. That's the thought. And if you believe that, then you are a non-reductive physicalist. Now, really, really briefly, we'll talk about what that means for science in general. So here's two different pictures of the way that science could develop into the future. There's a reductionist picture that says, actually, the more that we know, the more high-level sciences will, in some sense, collapse into lower-level sciences. So biology will become chemistry, will become a branch of chemistry. Chemistry will become a branch of physics. Psychology will become a branch of biology, right? So the whole sort of hierarchy of the sciences will kind of collapse down into, ultimately, there's just physics. That's the ultimate dream of the reductionist, that in the end, it's all just physics, and furthermore, we will explain everything and understand it in terms of physics. Now, they're not saying that's going to happen anytime soon, but that's kind of the dream of the ultimate end of science. Contrast that with the non-reductive physicalist picture of how science might develop, where you might be done physics. Like you could just finish physics. Nonetheless, there's work to do in mind sciences, or you could finish mind sciences and still have work to do in physics. That these sciences will continue to develop kind of autonomously, right? In the same way that you could deeply, deeply understand the physics of wood and still be working on chess, because they're just different levels of explanation. So in the end, at the end of science, you'll still have multiple levels of explanation and understanding that don't collapse into each other. So that's the picture of the so-called autonomy of the special sciences. And that's the kind of non-reductive physicalist picture of how the sciences will continue to develop in the future, assuming that we don't extinct ourselves in the next 100 years or so. So I'll just leave you quickly with this quote from Jerry Fodor, who argues for the thesis of the autonomy of the special sciences. So then, why is there anything except physics? Well, I admit that I don't know why. Rare moment of humility for Jerry Fodor. I don't even know how to think about why. I expect to figure out why there's anything except physics the day before I figure out why there's anything at all, in another, presumably related metaphysical conundrum that I find perplexing. So this is Jerry Fodor saying, why should there be anything other than physics? Who knows? Okay. Anyway. Okay. Thanks for hanging in. That's enough for today. Next time we'll continue to talk about qualia and the explanatory gap.